My name is Alexis Drogoul. I'm a researcher at IRD. Originally a computer scientist working in artificial intelligence and robotics, and now specialized in modeling, computer modeling and simulation of complex socio-economical systems. I'm working in Vietnam since 12 years. I've trained 10 Vietnamese PhDs during these 12 years. I've participated to a number of summer schools with the aim of building the capacity of Vietnamese institutions to cope with disasters, and especially water-related disasters, but also long evolutions like climate change. The plenary session I'm going to give tomorrow is about water-related disaster risk reduction. The goal is to raise the awareness of the audience, of the pupils and other trainers, about the fact that disaster risk reduction, and especially water-related disaster risk reduction, is a very complex task which involves, of course, physical knowledge about disasters themselves, exposure of people, but also knowledge more related to, let's say, social sciences regarding the vulnerability of people. And this aspect is a key aspect if we want to be able to reduce the risks associated with water in Asia, especially. Vulnerability is a key concept to tackle. And I will propose during my plenary to basically first an explanation of the different concepts involved in risk reduction. And second, one of the possible ways to tackle vulnerability, and especially vulnerability related to first alert, emergency, and evacuation processes. One of the methodologies I will present tomorrow is based on computer modeling and simulation of evacuation processes in order to, on one hand, enhance the risk assessment we can make when we combine exposure, vulnerability, and the hazard itself. And on the other hand, be able to explore different options. So serve as a basis to explore different strategies, different plans, different ways of evacuating or communicating with the population when it's time to evacuate. These different models are based on one technology, which is agent-based modeling. And this plenary will also serve as an introduction for 1 week workshop number 3, which is precisely about using this technology and methodology associated to design evacuation strategies in case of flooding, and especially urban flooding. So I would like to first begin with a short movie. It won't be long, okay? Probably I've seen it already. Just to introduce the subject of my talk today. Okay. So it took 10 minutes this day between the earthquake and the tsunami. It took 10 minutes to destroy approximately 1,000 little cities on the coast of Japan, east coast of Japan. And this is, well, actually, this is not exactly what we are talking about today, what I will be talking about today. But we will see that there are strong relations with the subject I will be talking about. What we see here, actually, is a hazard, so it's tsunami, destroying completely a city where you have communities of people, so population of the city, trying to escape this city. And so these people are exposed to the risk. They live on the coast, okay? And what we see here, actually we don't see it in the movie, but I will talk about it a little bit later, is that although we are in Japan, and although people are really prepared regarding hazards and natural disasters, most of the death and the death tolls actually this day, on the 11th of March 2011, were people dying in their car or on the road trying to escape tsunami. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about, and I will do it, of course, using my background, which is computers, well, artificial intelligence, and now computer modeling and simulation. And I'm going to talk about what kind of simulations, what kind of computer models we can use, actually, to support evacuation strategies in case of flooding. So it's a more general case than only tsunami. Sometimes it can be very different. You can have very slow onset flooding. So I will talk mainly about quick onset floodings, rapid onset flooding, sorry. So like flash floods, for example, or very, very rapid flooding of rivers. So this is the kind of disasters we are going to talk about here, and we'll see how new computer tools like computer models and simulations can support actually designing strategies, plans, and participate to disaster risk reduction. So first of all, let's put all of this in context. Okay, so not only Japan and East Coast and the tsunami, but the general context. So these are the numbers for 2018. Okay. So floods, if we take a look at all the disasters that happened last year, floods, including those created by tsunamis or very heavy storms, account for, well, they are the most common disasters. Okay, and they account for the most affected people. So people who have to migrate, to move, to change home, to be relocated, etc., etc. So they don't account for the biggest death toll. Okay, but the total affected is clearly flood. Something that will be of interest for us here is that if we look now at the distribution of floods per country, and here, so it's not 2018, it's between 2001 to 2017, you can see that Asian countries, okay, well, they pay the heaviest tribute worldwide to flooding. Okay. And if we restrict ourselves to tsunami, then of course it's even worse, especially during this period where you had at least 3 very big tsunamis hitting, well, India, Indonesia, and of course Japan. Okay, so what is clear is that in Asia, whatever the country, the risk associated to water, whatever risk we are talking about, is real, and people live with it. Okay. In every country, people live with risks associated to water. So water is not only a gift, water is not only something which is valuable for the communities, it's also a danger.
it's also a risk. And we are in Cambodia. We have people coming from Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, etc. And we all know that in these countries, people take the risk of living near rivers, okay? Because you have plains, floodplains, and floodplains are, of course, very interesting for agriculture. People take the risk to live near the sea because you can have a number of economical activities directly related to the sea. So it's important to understand that we live in countries where people, since centuries, have been used to take the risk as well, to take the risk to live in places where water-related risks are real. Okay. So the thing is, how can we contribute? Well, all together with all our specialties and domains, how can we contribute to reduce it? Okay. How can we reduce this risk, knowing that, and I say it a little bit in advance, but we can't just remove it, okay? We can't just suppress it. So there is no way to suppress a tsunami. It's extremely difficult to suppress big floodings of the large rivers we have in Southeast Asia. So how can we contribute to reduce it? First thing to understand is that when we talk about risk, we are actually talking about something which is a little bit complex. It's not just a simple concept that we would be able to share without any difficulty of, I don't know, domain or specialties or expertise, etc. It's something quite complex, and you will find a lot of definitions, actually. I took the one of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is probably one of the most reliable source of information on this. And basically what they say is that when we talk about risk, whatever the risk we're talking about, it's a combination of several factors, and usually 3 factors, which are the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Okay, so when we're talking about risk, we have to keep in mind that these 3 notions, these 3 concepts, will have to be mobilized. And for example, if we're talking about risk reduction, then we have to play one of these different concepts and see what we can exactly reduce, actually. Okay, what we can suppress, maybe. So hazard is difficult, exposure, vulnerability, maybe, and we will see how. So what we call hazard, again, many definitions, but basically the United Nations Office defines it as a phenomenon, okay, so which is outside a little bit the scope of responsibility of human communities. We will see later that it's not always the case. That may cause loss of life, property damage, social disruptions, or environmental degradation. So it's a quite large definition. You can put a lot of things under this. So, for example, here I give some examples. Urban floods in Hanoi after heavy rain episodes. Okay, these are hazards. Hazards can also be man-made, so due to the action of people. So, for example, here a dam break in the US. So it's not exactly man-made, but it's something, an infrastructure built by human which fails at some point, okay, and which create a hazard which did not exist before. Okay. Then we have exposure. Okay, so the second component, exposure. So what is exposure? It's, simply put, it's a measure. So it's a kind of counting, for example, the number of people who will live near a river if you think about flooding risks. Okay, So it's a measure of people, infrastructures, housing, of course, other tangible assets, okay, and usually human assets, located in hazard-prone areas. Okay, so there is a spatial component in it, very strong spatial component. It's difficult to talk about exposure without talking about the space in which the hazard is taking place. So one of the examples, for example, here, again, it's in Hanoi. So you have, I have a pointer. Okay, so here, actually, you have a dike. Here, you have the river, so it's difficult. It's a red river, so it's not exactly blue river. Difficult to see on the picture. And so you have a dike, and then you have what is called the flood zone. Okay, the zone beyond the dike, outside the dike. And it's one of the most dense, one of the most dense areas of Hanoi. Okay, so the density of the population here is higher than anywhere else in Hanoi. So here we can talk about exposure. People living there are exposed to one of the most common hazards, which would be, in that case, river flooding. We can also talk about exposure. For example, if you take a look at the housing, so how people are living, how their houses are built. But in any case, it is always something we can measure quite easily. Okay, exposure is supposed to be measurable quite easily through surveys, etc., etc. So why are we interested in knowing this parameter? That there have been a number of works. I took the most, maybe the most famous one by Jonkman in 2007, which establishes a very clear and maybe obvious for you, but actually it was published and it was not obvious to anyone. Very clear correlation between the number of exposed people and the number of casualties, fatalities, after the disaster. Okay. So it means if we are able, we are talking about correlation here, not causality, but one of the ideas we could have is to say, okay, if we reduce the number of people exposed to a disaster, maybe we can reduce the fatalities, which is not completely stupid as an idea. Okay. So that's why we're so interested in computing this. And then we have the third component, vulnerability. And here, it's really more complicated. Okay. And here normally we, for the first two ones, we can mobilize quite easily, I would say physical sciences, okay? Whatever their specialty, so hydrology or anything, but physical sciences. For vulnerability, then most of the measurements we will be able to do, counting will be able to do, will come from social sciences. Okay, and we are suddenly jumping into less hard science. Okay, so how is it defined? Actually, it's defined as the physical, social, economic, and environmental factors which increase the susceptibility to hazards. So actually, it means, okay, we have exposed people. Well, we have people who are exposed to the disaster, and depending on some other parameters, which can be the poverty, which can be, well, we will see some of them later, they will be more susceptible, for example, to die from this disaster than their neighbors. Okay. The main problem here is to be able to define what we're talking about when we're talking about vulnerability. So I won't do it this afternoon because it's been 40 years that people are talking about vulnerability, and there are no definition on which everybody agrees upon. But this is something, it's so soft as a concept that it's probably in this area that we can make progress to reduce the risk associated to disasters. Okay. So an example here. Okay, so the shelter offered or not by houses of people. One interesting thing is that vulnerability is not only the individual vulnerability of people, it's also the vulnerability of the society as a system. Okay. So for example, if we don't have any good political leadership, or if, I don't know, no first alert is given, okay, this is part of vulnerability. So in a way, vulnerability, it's a place where you put everything you cannot put in the two previous ones. Okay? Everything which is a little bit too complicated to compute, actually, you put it in vulnerability. So when we talk about reduction, then when we talk about disaster risk reduction, so how to reduce the risk of associated to a disaster, basically what we have in mind and what people have in mind is, on one hand, assessing the current risks. Okay, so what kind of risks are the people living here and there facing right now? But also, because it's a matter of policy, being able to predict future risks in order to take, for example, appropriate measures, etc., etc. So risk assessment, and then I took an example actually to show you what we are talking about when we doing risk assessment. Risk assessment, it's then real part of disaster risk reduction. If we want to reduce the risk, we have to be able to assess it. Okay. Again, it sounds completely obvious and stupid, but it's really important to clearly distinguish the different works we have to do. So first, we have to assess the risk. We have to measure it. Okay. We have to know, and we have to be able, maybe, to assess if any progress can be made using a policy, a rule, or anything. So I took an example here. It's a flood risk assessment of Quang Nam. It's a Vietnamese province, a central Vietnamese province. It's really at the center of Vietnam, in red here. And actually, this complicated diagram is not so complicated. It simply says that in their case, flood risk assessment is composed of 3 different assessments, as we said previously. So we have to assess the hazard, okay? We have to assess the exposure, and we have to assess the vulnerability. And to do that, then they took a number of criteria. So it's not, it's a recipe, okay? There is nothing in any manual saying you have to do this and this and this to assess flood risk assessment. They used this first because the data was available. Sometimes you want to use some criterion to assess the importance of a disaster, but you don't have the data, so it's no use in using this criterion. So here they had the data, and second, they considered, and you can read the paper, I cite it here, they considered that these different measures were good proxies to express, for example, vulnerability of people or exposure of people or the importance of the hazard, etc. So the flood hazard, they used 2 criteria. And these criteria, because you cannot reproduce a hazard, okay? So you cannot do it in laboratory. So these criteria were taken from historical data, historical records of similar hazards in the same area. It's very common, okay? Most of the time, we have only the historical records to tell us what can happen in which places. In Japan, it was the same, okay? The only problem is that they faced a tsunami which was higher than all the previous ones they had to face. So they took two different things, and here you can see that immediately they began to spatialize things, and this is, well, I don't know actually of any risk assessment which is not spatialized. Okay, well, disaster risk assessment. So they took the depth of the flood, so how many meters of water, and duration. Okay. So some of these data were already available. Others had to be recalled actually from people, memory of people. So saying, okay, the water reached such height in my house, and for 3 days, for example. Okay. So then, with this, you build a map. Okay, and in order to understand what's happening, you can add some physical measures. So here it's very easy. So here you have, for example, a digital elevation map, which gives you the altitude actually of the height of the ground compared to the sea level height. Then the exposure. What did they use for exposure? They use different things, more as kind of proxies to estimate if actually what it meant to say these people are at risk. Okay. So you have one which is maybe a little bit obvious, which is a distance to river. Okay. So when you're close to a river, you're a little bit more at risk than when you're far away from it. The density of the population, and we will come back to this later. Density of the population, actually it means that in very dense places, it's more complete. You are more exposed actually than in scarce places. And then land use categories. Land use categories here, it's basically because there is a difference between urban floods and rural floods. One of the main differences is that cities, well, it's a built environment, okay? And built environment means usually that it's a more impermeable environment, okay? So flooding occurs a little bit differently, and risks are higher. Risks of flooding for people are higher. And now regarding vulnerability, well, as I said previously, all the elements not described in the previous steps, they just, everybody puts everything here. So you have very different, you have apples and oranges, okay, in the same place. So you have the poverty rate, okay, poverty rate, and here, well, it's something that you can get with the census, so it's okay, it's a measure you can get quite easily from the census. But it's put in here with an interpretation, okay? That people who are a little bit, well, who are poorer will be more at risk than people who are richer. In the paper, there is absolutely nothing to back this assumption, okay? We can agree or not agree. It's part of the risk assessment. But it shows that as soon as we are talking about vulnerability, we are entering we are entering a territory of interpretations, okay, where we use proxies to express the fact that people are more or less at risk. Another one is road density, okay, so road density, here, supposedly, when the density of road is a little bit higher, you are safer than when the density of roads is lower, because you can escape more easily. But again, it's completely interpretation, okay? Because you can also say that the more roads you have, the more the environment is built, so the more the flooding can be fast, for example. Number of doctors and nurses in the surroundings, okay? So again, an interpretation of the vulnerability of people given their proximity to doctors. So, etc., etc. Well, what is important here is really to understand that when we're talking about vulnerability, we're really talking about something where everybody can put in its own interpretations and criteria. There is no methodology to account for the vulnerability of people. Okay. So of course, people are writing reports, papers. They of course, well, there are a number of written reports which can help in building vulnerability index for risk management or other duties. But again, here I could add anything in this. Okay, number of cars per people, number of motorbikes owned by the family. Basically, nobody would argue with me about the interest or not of this kind of indices. So I don't say that it's useless. Actually, it gives a number of information, provides a number of information. But again, one thing which is quite sure is that we try to project something which is dynamic, which is a society, life of people, into something completely static. And that's the main problem, because when you combine everything, okay, when you combine all the maps we have seen previously, you obtain usually what is the main outcome of a risk assessment task, which is a risk assessment map or report, or both together, where at every point in space here, you are able to say, okay, living here means you're a little bit more at risk than your neighbors living 100 meters away, which are a little bit more at risk than the others. Okay. So, of course, this is important to produce this, and I don't deny the fact that actually already with this, we can take good decisions. The thing is, it's missing a number of things. One is that the information which is produced a little bit in line with what has been done on the GIS, using GIS methodologies for the last 20 or 30 years, is most of the time static. Okay, so we produce a map. And the map is supposed to capture both static data and also dynamic data. Okay? Because when you add, for example, the proximity to the road, to a road, of course you have in mind the idea that people will escape. But again, what is the interest of a road if there is no central first alert which is given to people? Okay, so if we don't talk about the collective or policy-making duties or tasks, so a lot of the things here are completely static, and I won't spend much time on this, but being static means that there are very little predictive capabilities. So actually we can use this to assess the current situation, but we can't use these risk assessment maps or reports to predict what the risk will be in different scenarios. Okay. Well, it's more difficult. We can do it, actually. We can produce thousands of maps, but it's more complicated and a lot of work to do it. Another thing here, but it's more about the methodology used for risk assessment, is that this kind of maps do not capture the interactions between hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. So basically, they are based on the assumption that things are a little bit separate. Okay? But we all know that there are some feedback loops between these different components. That hazards can be created by people living in exposed area and because of their vulnerability. For example, they will erode the banks of a river because they need to use the banks of the river to build houses or things like this. So of course, there are feedback loops between these different components. But these risk assessment maps can't really capture them. Well, actually, it's a methodology which can't capture it. One other important thing, and this is especially important in Asia, because it's a continent where you have the faster urbanization rate in the world, actually, is that when we are talking about flooding in Asia, now more and more we're talking about urban floods. Urban floods, because, well, we have megalopoles, we have very big cities, and making risk assessment and risk prediction in a urban environment is really complex, because urbanization will play a two-sided role. In one hand, it will, for example, benefit to people, because if you look, for example, at the criteria we took previously, then when you're in the city, you're very close to a doctor, usually, very close to a road, okay? So seems to be very beneficial in terms of vulnerability. But you create new vulnerabilities when you're living in the urban environment. So you have, of course, this is quite, well, it's mathematical. You have an increased density of people and assets. So if a town is hit by a disaster, you have, of course, more chance to have more casualties. The accessibility, so having a road is not enough. Okay, you need to have a clear road to be able to move on it. So the accessibility, if you look at Phnom Penh or Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Bangkok, well, maybe not Vientiane, I don't know, but big cities in Asia are completely stuck at some time, at some hours of the day. So the accessibility to some zones and dense zones is more complex. You have also an increased social segmentations, which means that in the same, you will have a zoning of the city, actually, and the services are not offered in exactly the same way, depending on the area you're living in. So the first alerts, the emergency services, which will not be available exactly in the same way, depending on where you're living in, which can provide a false sense of security for people. Okay. And then, well, the built environment, I already talked about it. And also the fact that cities, at least in Asia, are expanding. And usually they're expanding in dangerous zones, exposed zones. Okay. And usually the ones who are who are participating to the expansion of the city are populations which are already vulnerable. Okay, so other precarious or with economic status below actually the average of the city. As I said, we also have one problem with risk assessment is that it is mainly static. Okay. And given the it depends on the disasters, but basically, we are now able to build dynamic models of how a disaster hits a city, a coast, territory. Okay. We are now able to have a kind of differential assessment of the hazard given its dynamics. So it is now available, a little bit complicated to use in risk assessment, but it is possible to do it. Okay. What is missing is the possibility to do the same for vulnerability. Why would I do the same for vulnerability? Let's just take a very simple example. If the Japanese tsunami in 2011 had hit the different cities at 2 a.m. in the morning, the number of casualties would have been much higher. Okay. So the vulnerability of people is not something which is fixed and static. It depends also on what they are doing, where they are, and we all know that, well, for people having occupations, they move in the city. They are not exactly at the same place. And you also have a number of different constraints which are linked to these occupations. Okay, so when you're a teacher, for example, are you going to evacuate if a tsunami strikes and leaving the children? Of course not. So basically it means that your vulnerability to the tsunami will be much higher at that precise moment than if it was on a Sunday, for example, with no school. So that's why it's important to take into account the dynamic vulnerability of people and the differential vulnerability of people given their occupation, given the different constraints, etc. So dynamic models of vulnerability are one of the keys to flood risk reduction. And one of them, it's been a long introduction, but I finally come to my subject. One of them is the models of evacuation we can hide in them, we can put in them. Because evacuation is clearly the key process here. Being able to evacuate people, it's providing ourselves the possibility to suddenly lower their vulnerability. Okay. If you know that a flash flood will occur, and you let people in their houses, okay, without providing a first alert, without any emergency teams going around, etc., of course you are, well, you leave people to their computed vulnerability. But it is possible to act. It is possible to have plans. It is possible to have strategies. One of them being obvious, which is a communication strategy. How do you communicate to people? Okay. Well, not so obvious actually, but so there are a number of things that can be done to reduce the vulnerability of people. And this is precisely what models of evacuations are for. Because on one hand, they will contribute, having a good model of evacuation of what can be done to evacuate people, can contribute to understand the exact vulnerability of people and maybe reduce the risk associated to a disaster. And on the other hand, it allows to explore different options. Okay? What happens if we, for example, communicate only, I think it's, yeah, what is called, for example, phased. Here you have the term. I'm sorry for the other screen. I'm always here, but phased evacuation. Okay, what is phased evacuation? Phased evacuation is simply to say, we will play a very dangerous game. We will only communicate with, let's say, half of the population. Okay, only give the first alert to half of the population, or maybe 1/3 of the population. And then progressively, we will communicate to everyone. Why do that? Just because of traffic jams. Okay, so it sounds completely stupid again, but if you put everyone on the streets, especially at 2 a.m. in the morning, just imagine what it would mean in Bangkok or Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. It would be a disaster, actually. So, well, another disaster in top of the previous one. And so, phased evacuation is clearly a strategy, okay? Strategy of communication, strategy to avoid completely overloading the emergency services and of course the streets, and models of evacuation, so simulations of evacuations, can be used to assess actually their effectiveness. Okay, assess whether or not they have an influence on the number of casualties, for example. The problem we have since at least 20 or 30 years is that in the classical models of evacuation, the population is considered as completely homogeneous. Okay, so basically it's like particles. Okay, so you have a fluid with particles, and people are moving around in the streets. like most of the traffic models, basically. So it can work for traffic and for normal traffic. It's quite difficult when you're talking about evacuation, because people, we all know that people are in a mental state which is not exactly compatible with a fluid traffic. Okay. So we need to stop considering people as homogeneous. So we need to take into account the heterogeneity of people's profiles, beginning simply with their age. Okay, so a baby of 6 months old will not evacuate exactly like, I don't know, someone from 40 years. There are people we need to take care of, etc., etc. We need to take account also, the impact of this heterogeneity on the mobility of people. Okay, so some people will be mobile, others not. Some will require actually the help and the support of emergency services, some not, etc., etc. We need to take into account also the heterogeneity of transportation means. Okay, so it seems like a detail, but actually when you are escaping from a flash flood or tsunami, if you need to run for 5 or 6 kilometers, for many people it's simply not feasible. Okay, so they will take their car, because also maybe the car can allow them to transport and to carry some goods, etc., etc. A family as well. Some will take their motorbike. Well, in Hanoi, for example, most of them will take the motorbike. Bikes, go by foot. Some will not take everything because they are on wheelchairs, etc., etc. So again, we have to face the fact that when we're talking about evacuation, we're not talking about something completely homogeneous. We have very different profiles, and it also depends on when and where people are located. Okay, so we need to know that, actually. If we want to be able to just simply do something, we need to know where people are. It's a lot of data, okay? What I'm talking about, it's a lot of data. But it is data that can be obtained quite easily. For example, during drills, okay? So the Japanese government, and the Japanese municipalities organize drills very regularly, okay? Or every month or every 2 months. People are supposed, whatever the time, whenever they hear the first alert, they are supposed actually to play their role, to play the game. And you have researchers, you have experts, you have people paid by the municipalities, which record the data. Record what the people were doing at that time. Okay, so if you have 10,000 people playing the game, playing their role in a drill, then these people will be, the occupations of these people, where they were, etc., etc., will be recorded and used for evacuation models. We need also to take into account things which usually we don't take into account when we're talking about traffic models, classical traffic models. For example, panic movements, okay? Or very emergent crowd dynamics. Sometimes I don't know if we have the same references, but there was so it was not a disaster actually, but in a stadium, I think it was in Germany, Heysel. Belgium, sorry. So you had a panic movement of the crowd, okay, and I don't know, tens of people just crushed by the others, okay. And it happens every day, every time you have a disaster, okay, you have panic movements. Because again, people are in a mental state, which is very different than, let's say, their normal mental states, if such things exist. So crowd dynamics, panic movements, traffic loading, okay, I already talked about it, but it's a very important part of evacuation models. So the question is, how can we take all of this into account in models, simulations? Okay. One of the technologies, one of the methodologies we can use is called agent-based computer modeling. So it is more and more used in precisely this kind of, I would say, investigation, which is at the limit of, well, disaster reduction and research. Okay. So we are really at the limit here. Simply put, agent-based models are computer models, okay, where you program little programs, little softwares, which are called agents, and to which you give some abilities to interact with others, to perceive their environment, to perceive the others, to communicate with each other, etc., etc. Okay, we'll just give some more details after that. So the interesting thing in agent-based models is that actually they are not here to really predict things. You cannot use them to predict things, okay? Because there is no way you can validate these kind of models. Absolutely no way. But we can use them because at the heart of these models, you have the possibility to make things, higher level things, emerge from the interactions of micro level agents, okay? So you want to reproduce a crowd movement or a crowd panic, you can do it. It will never be exactly the one you have maybe in your street during an evacuation. But at least it can give you an idea. And especially here, that's the most interesting thing is, well, the less visible. It's the fact that it enables that to make emerge the most vulnerable and least resilient aspects of the system to be identified. Okay, if you have a bottleneck, it will appear immediately. If you have weaknesses in your system, it's very easy to spot them. And I will show you later how we do it. So for those of you who are absolutely not modelers or absolutely not computer scientists, so it means majority of you actually, what do we call a model in computer science? It's quite simple actually. It's a simplified representation of a system. Okay, so you, as a researcher, you decide about the system you want to study, you want to understand. And then you build something which is designed in such a way that it can help you in answering some question about the system. So here you want to know if evacuation strategy is effective or not. Then you will build a complete environment, okay, with artificial engines playing the role of people, trying to evacuate all together whenever a first alert is emitted. And you will apply different strategies, maybe of communication, to alert them, and try to use this proxy, in that case, this model, to answer questions about the reality. This representation is not the reality. So it means that whatever you will, whatever lessons you will draw from these experiments, it's exactly like thought experiments, okay, but with a little bit more horsepower. Okay, here you can play 2,000, 3,000 scenarios. In your mind, it's a little bit more complicated to do it, or on the paper, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's nothing more actually. Okay, so it's important to understand that. When we execute models, when we run models, okay, computer models, we call it, it's called simulations. Okay, so when I talk about simulation, it's simply a model that we run in a given scenario. And a scenario, it's nothing more than some parameters with some values. Okay, number of people, density of the habitat, different parameters, the hour of the day where the alert is emitted, etc., etc. It defines a scenario. And then you can run, well, it depends on the complexity of your models, of course, but you can run as many scenarios as you want, as many simulations as you want, which can give you some insights about the dynamics at play in reality. Again, it will not explain anything. Okay, it's important to understand that. So when we talk about agent-based models, it's simply that we use actually a kind of individual-based representation, or for those of you who are computer scientists, actually, maybe there are some, object-based representation. Okay, it's very close to that, where we have tools, software that are programmable and that can be used actually to represent individuals, groups, institutions, environments, whatever factor you want in a model. So if I take, I don't know, children playing on a sand beach here, playing football on a sand beach, I can model them as agents, each of them individually. Okay, there will be little programs in the computer. The environment itself will be programmed as a software. Okay, and using different theories and methodologies, etc., I can provide them with a number of capabilities. And among these capabilities, you have individual decision making. Okay, so it can be, for example, a number of rules. So if I receive an alert, then I move to this place, etc., etc. So decision making, behaviors, communication with others. Okay, so for example, an institution which is supposed to emit a first alert will be an agent able to communicate with some other agents. Actions, so to change the value of the variables, attributes of the others, or the environment. Interactions, okay, so when two agents change something in each other. Perception of others also, and the environment is the same. So we have now accumulated methodologies, tools, platforms to program these things, etc., etc. So it's all of these things are coming directly from artificial intelligence. Okay, they share a number of things with artificial intelligence. It has diverged somehow because the task of modeling and simulation is a little bit different than the one promoted by artificial intelligence. So here we don't want to recreate proto-humans. Okay, we create agents and we reason about them. But we are not here to mimic people exactly as if they were real people. Okay, so these programs, they run usually on specific software platforms. So like the one we will use in workshop 3. Okay, so I don't know if all the trainers are over there. So in workshop 3, so it's a open source platform. And what is interesting, after all of these technologies used to produce these programs, what is really interesting is that when we simulate these little programs, we actually recreate a micro world, okay, a small world, where you, as a designer, you can act like a god. Okay, you can change anything. You want to change a little bit the disaster, you change it. You want to change the reaction of people, you change it. So it's a lot of freedom. It's a lot of open possibilities. It's also, of course, a lot of constraints. Okay, a lot of technologies also to master and to be able to use interestingly. But it is important to understand that the goal is here to recreate micro worlds on which we can experiment and which we can measure, in which we can measure things exactly like we would in the real world. We use the same tools, statistical tools, different okay, I don't. I can't get the name. Anyway, well, not in English, but it doesn't matter. So we are able to really reuse all the methodologies used, for example, for risk assessment, to assess what happens in each of the occurrences of these micro worlds. Okay. So I will finish actually on the presentation of a project which is exactly directly related to what I'm talking about today. So a lot of the things I have shown here are taken from a project which is called ESCAPE, okay, which is funded by the French National Research Agency for up to, well, from 1 year ago to 2 years in the future, so in 21. So ESCAPE means so exploring by simulation cities awareness on population evacuation. Not completely sure the acronym is really useful here because ESCAPE is quite easy to understand. So there are a number of French laboratories working on this topic, and ESCAPE is actually a very original project because we have researchers and practitioners, and especially two companies, two French companies, who are working with municipalities to establish the flood risk assessment for French municipalities. So it's up to 10,000 different small towns. And the goal for these two companies is to be able to attach actually to the risk assessment, flood risk assessment, attach some vulnerability index, but a dynamic one. Okay, so attach simulations of vulnerability for different scenarios. So here you see, well, mostly traffic. Well, actually, I won't explain what happens, but you have blocked roads. You have a chemical hazard on the city of Rouen in France. So it's a terrible scenario happening behind me, but you won't see anything of it. So there are many use cases in ESCAPE. One of them is in Saumur, so it's another city, small city, 12,000 people in France. So here the goal is really to integrate evacuation plans into disaster risk management and to integrate disaster evacuation simulations in these disaster risk, flood risk reports. So you have on the left all the data which has been necessary to gather to build these different things. Okay, and here you have one run of one simulation. So what is interesting is that we are able, during the run of a simulation, we are able to monitor things, actually. Okay, to record everything which is happening. So these kind of simulations are really data intensive, because they're using a lot of data, but they're also producing a lot of data. Okay, and this is where artificial intelligence comes back by the window, actually. It's that we need to process, when you run 1,000 scenarios, okay, like this one or even more, 1 million scenarios if you want, then we can't do it by hand, actually. So we need to process the data in order to find, for example, correlations between interesting variables or parameters, or these kind of things. Another, another use case of ESCAPE is in a district called Phu Sa in Hanoi, actually. So it's one of the districts you saw on the flood zone. Okay, so Phu Sa is one of the exposed districts of Hanoi in case of river flooding. And here we take hopefully a scenario which will never happen, which is a dam break, and especially one very specific dam, the Hoa Binh Dam, which is up north, actually, on the Red River. So we know more or less that if there is a breach in this dam, the wave, so something like a 10 meters high wave, so 10 meters it's quite high, it's for 4 floors. A 10 meters high wave will take something like 20 minutes to hit the flood zone here. So the goal of these simulations is really to say, how can we evacuate a flood zone, which is basically a slum. Okay? So it's between slum and the real built environment, where the streets measure something between 1 and 2 meters wide. How can we evacuate it in less than 20 minutes? Okay. You can't have cars. Well, hopefully you don't have a lot of cars, but you have motorbikes, you have people going by foot. So that's that's what we're doing in Hanoi with the help of the University of Architecture, urban planning as well, which is interested in maybe generalizing this strategy, these kind of simulations for other districts. And to conclude, I will just say that the subject I have been talking about this afternoon will be actually the main topic of the lectures and hands-on projects of WANASI workshop number 3, which is here about water urban risks, designing evacuation strategies, etc. Okay, so it's you still have the time to change workshop if you want. No, sorry, no, you can't. No, I'm really sorry. Okay, so thank you very much.